What is the strangest mystery that is still unsolved? The Circleville Letters. In 1976, residents of the small city south of Columbus, Ohio, began receiving handwritten, sinister, and graphic letters. Each letter included secret and dark details about their personal lives. One resident received a ton of letters, accusing her of various unsavory acts. The author warned the resident that he had been keeping an eye on her home, as well as her comings and goings. The resident was horrified and tried to keep the letters a secret until her husband began receiving them. The attacks on the family continued, with large posters appearing around town spreading rumors about their 12-year-old child. One day in 1977, the husband left the house after receiving a call from who he thought was writing the letters. A few minutes later, the husband was found dead at the end of the street, dead behind the wheel. The sheriff had ruled it a homicide when he realized that a single shot had been fired before the accident, but there was no evidence that the husband was shot at the site. The sheriff found the husband was twice the legal limit and ruled it a drunk driving accident. The letters began once again, this time accusing the sheriff of covering up the true nature of the death. The letters also accused the sheriff of mishandling an investigation into the county coroner, who had been accused of other grotesque acts. The harassment continued, this time with signs along the road, and in 1983, the original resident, who had been accused of having an affair, pulled over to remove a sign. During the effort to remove the sign, she discovered a box was attached and inside of it was a small pistol. The gun was part of a booby trap designed to fire when the sign was removed. Paul Fresauer was arrested and given 25 years. But one small problem. The letter writing continued even after Fresauer was put in jail. In a new batch of letters, the author had promised to dig up the grave of a deceased baby and mail the bones to the police in the case of another potential affair turned murder. Hundreds of residents continued to receive personal letters until 1994, when everything stopped. The lost a bomb off the coast of America, which the U.S. government said not to worry about in the 50s and tried to cover up, was dumped in the ocean in an aviation accident, and it's still lost to this day. 100 times more powerful than what was dropped in Japan. The Oakville Blob. In 1994, there was a rainstorm in Oakville, only the raindrops were a strange, clear substance that had the consistency of jello. Lots of people experienced flu-like symptoms after coming into contact with it, and people's dogs and cats all over the city were dying. When a local hospital ran a lab test on the substance after one of the patients suggested it, it was found that whatever this mysterious rain was, it had human white blood cells in it. Sometime after that, a sample was also sent to the Washington State Health Laboratory, where it was being researched by epidemiologist Mike McDowell. After he determined that it was man-made and speculated that it was some sort of matrix for transporting viruses or bacteria, the samples suddenly went missing from the containment facility, and his supervisor told him not to ask any questions. There are no known samples of the stuff anywhere today, despite being sent to several different facilities by various Oakville residents. So, yeah, personally say that this was clearly some sort of bioweapon test run. But by whom? I'd like to give the U.S. government the benefit of the doubt here and assume it wasn't us testing something like that on our own citizens. But if it wasn't, why would it have been covered up like that? And you'd think an event like this would be a lot less obscure. Also, even if it being a bioweapon seems super obvious, how the heck did whoever dispersed it manage to make it rain over an entire city for several days? This dude got lost in the catacombs, and they found camera footage of his journey. But at some point, he drops the camera and just starts to run. As far as I know, nobody has found out what happened to him. The toxic death of Gloria Ramirez. 23 people became ill due to her mere presence, and 5 were hospitalized. We have never worked out what happened. There's an episode of the Stuff You Should Know podcast that talks about it. About 8:15 p.m. on the evening of February 19, 1994, Ramirez, suffering from severe heart palpitations, was brought into the emergency department of Riverside General Hospital by paramedics. She was extremely confused and was suffering from tachycardia and Cheyne-Stokes respiration. The medical staff injected her with diazepam, midazolam, and lorazepam to sedate her. When it became clear that Ramirez was responding poorly to treatment, the staff tried to defibrillate her heart. At that point, several people saw an oily sheen covering Ramirez's body, and some noticed a fruity, garlic-like odor that they thought was coming from her mouth. A registered nurse named Susan Kane attempted to draw blood from Ramirez's arm and noticed an ammonia-like smell coming from the tube. She passed the syringe to Julie Gurchinsky, a medical resident who noticed manila-colored particles floating in the blood. At this point, Kane fainted and was removed from the room. Shortly thereafter, Gurchinsky began to feel nauseated. Complaining that she was lightheaded, she left the trauma room and sat at a nurse's desk. A staff member asked her if she was okay, but before she could respond, she also fainted. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist who was assisting in the trauma room, was the third to pass out. The staff was then ordered to evacuate all emergency department patients to the parking lot outside the hospital. Overall, 23 people became ill and 5 were hospitalized. A skeleton crew stayed behind to stabilize Ramirez. At 8:50 p.m., after 45 minutes of CPR and defibrillation, Ramirez was pronounced dead from kidney failure related to her cancer. Asha degree. Girl leaves her house in the middle of the night during a storm and disappeared. The only problem is that she was terrified of thunder and lightning and had no motive for leaving because her home life was fine. Then, her clothes and backpack were found a year later in an abandoned construction site. The Salish Sea Feet, or the Mad Axemen of New Orleans. The Salish Sea Feet are the approximately 20 dismembered feet found in or around British Columbia or Washington, USA. The feet sometimes are found still inside of shoes. No one knows how they got there or where they came from. Over the course of the last 13 years, the authorities have ruled out foul play. The Mad Axeman of New Orleans ran rampant in 1918 and 1919. He murdered 6 people, usually those of Italian descent, with axes or straight razors. In March of 1919, he sent a lengthy letter from hottest hell that was pretty nonsensical, but the most relevant paragraphs read, "Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." There were no murders that night because every dance hall in New Orleans was filled to capacity. How a lower-class English woman became an important Egyptian scholar based on her memories from her supposed past life as an ancient Egyptian priestess. She actually described a garden in an ancient temple that was later discovered matching her description, and in the location she said it was. She knew things that hadn't been published before and had been worshipping ancient Egyptian gods from the age of 3. The Overtuned Bridge. It's a bridge in Scotland where dogs always unexplainably jump off. It's very strange and nobody knows for certain why they do this. Dogs who survived reportedly walked back up and jumped off again. They even had to put up a warning sign to keep your dog on a leash and to watch them. A lot of theories say maybe it's because of certain scents or animals down below, but most people have disagreed with this theory. It's weird. Another one is Colonel Philip Shu's death. On April 16, 2003, 54-year-old Colonel Philip Shu left his Texas home and headed to work. 2 hours later, he was found dead in his car, an apparent victim of a car crash. The car was caved in on the driver's side, and Philip suffered major head trauma as a result. He was killed instantly. This is where it gets weird. Philip had a tear in his t-shirt under his fatigues. There, they could see a 6-inch vertical gash in his chest. Above the entrance to the 6th gash were at least 5 scratch marks, which the autopsy report said were consistent with hesitant marks. Both his nipples had been removed with surgical precision. The fifth digit on his left hand had been amputated, and his left ear had been lacerated down to the bone. Duct tape was dangling from both of his wrists and the top of his boots. It was ruled a suicide. 8-year-old kid says he was killed with the axe. The kid brought them to the exact location, and after some digging, they found an axe and remains. The kid told the police who killed him, and after interrogation, he admits to killing someone. No one knows how the kid knew all this. In 1977, we received a radio signal from outer space that lasted about 72 seconds. To this day, we still do not know where it originated from. Magdalena Zuck, a Polish woman who died in Egypt. She had arranged a trip to Egypt at very short notice as a surprise for her partner. He didn't have a valid passport and couldn't get one on time, so she went alone. Almost immediately, she began to act incredibly erratic, but was being helped by a Polish-speaking Egyptian man at the hotel. The hotel didn't want her, the hospital turned her away, and when she tried to board an earlier flight home, she was not allowed to board because of her behavior. Eventually, she was admitted to hospital, but despite being restrained, managed to jump out of the window. The boyfriend had arranged a mutual friend to come get her, but he arrived to find her dead. There's a conversation with her boyfriend which is one of the most disturbing things I've seen. There is evidence that the Egyptian man actually knew the boyfriend, and theories that the boyfriend was somehow in on all this, which is all very bizarre considering she planned the trip without him even knowing. On April 19, 1995, a truck bomb detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The explosion killed 168 in what was the deadliest terrorist attack on the United States. Until 9/11 to date, it still remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the country. One of the lesser-known things about this is the case of the missing leg. Investigators discovered the leg laying among the rubble and identified it belonging to Lakeisha Levy. The only problem was, she'd already been buried with both her legs. She was exhumed. Her severed leg was placed in her coffin, while the other leg was taken to the FI laboratory for identification. Since it had been embalmed, a DNA sample was unable to be obtained. The extra left leg, which had been mistakenly buried with Levy, is suspected to belong to an unidentified 169th victim, whose body had mostly disintegrated in the blast. This has led people to suspect there was an additional terrorist involved, even though perpetrators Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols had been convicted, with 2 others later identified as accomplices. So who was the possible additional bomber? They still remain unidentified now, 25 years after the attack.